I was the one who did it. I'm the man who stood up in the middle of a Sunday service, with the scent of old pine and dust in my nostrils, and threw the Word of God back in his face. It wasn't just any book. It was our family Bible, the one with my great-grandfather's name scrawled on the inside cover, the one my mother read to me from when I was a boy, her finger tracing the words of the Psalms. I walked right down that center aisle, the worn red carpet muffling my footsteps until the whole world seemed to go silent, and I heaved that sacred book right at the pulpit. The thud it made when it hit the floor echoed louder than any sermon I'd ever heard. That was my prayer, a prayer of rage, of defiance, a final bitter amen from a man who had forgotten how to ask for anything but an end to the pain. If you're already feeling the weight of this story, if you've ever felt that kind of desperation or anger at the heavens, I ask you to subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because you'll want to hear what happened in the seconds that followed. Give this video a like if you're willing to walk this hard road with me, and in the comments below, I'd be humbled if you'd just tell me what town or city you're watching from. It helps an old man feel a little less alone in telling a story this difficult. It truly does. My name is Silas, and for all of my 63 years, I've belonged to this red soil, right here in the heart of the country. I was born in the same farmhouse my father was, a house built with sweat and faith. Growing up, faith wasn't a choice. It was the air we breathed. It was in the grace we said before every meal, even when the meals were thin. It was in the hymns my wife, Martha, would hum while she hung the laundry, her voice like a gentle promise against the harshness of the sun. I was a proud man, proud of my calloused hands, proud of the straight furrows I could plow, proud of the life I'd built on the simple contract I believed I had with God. I would work hard, I would be a good man, and he would provide. For a long time he did. The fields gave us corn, the rains came when they were supposed to, and my daughter Abigail grew up strong and kind, a testament to a blessed life. But pride is a brittle thing. It can't stand up to the slow, grinding pressure of despair. It started with the drought 7 years back. The sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue and just stayed that way. The earth cracked open like a beggar's palm. My prayers, once confident and conversational, turned into desperate, one-sided bargains whispered into a dusty pillow at night. I'd walk my fields, the cornstalks like brittle skeletons, and I'd curse the silence from the heavens. That was when the bitterness first took root. It was a small, dark seed, but I watered it every day with my resentment. Then Martha got sick. It wasn't a sudden thing. It was a slow fading, a thief that stole the light from her eyes, the strength from her hands, the music from her voice. The doctors used long words I didn't understand, but all I saw was my rock, the unwavering faith of our family, being worn down to a pebble. That's when my conversations with God stopped being conversations and became accusations. I'd stand in that old barn, the smell of hay and failure thick in the air, and I'd shout at the rafters asking him what I'd done to deserve this. Was my work not hard enough? Was my faith not true enough? The silence that answered me was deafening. It was a cold, indifferent emptiness that hollowed me out. The breaking point came on a sweltering Sunday morning. I sat in that familiar wooden pew, listening to Pastor Michael talk about God's mysterious ways. And something inside me just snapped. Mysterious ways? I looked at my cracked, empty hands. I thought of Martha, lying in her bed, her breath a shallow whisper. I saw my daughter Abigail, sitting a few rows ahead with her husband, her face etched with a permanent worry that I had put there. And I saw the hypocrisy of it all, singing praises in a cool church while my world was burning down around me. So I stood up. I didn't plan it. It was a pure, unadulterated impulse born of years of simmering rage. I reached down and picked up that heavy family Bible from the pew beside me. Its leather cover was worn smooth by the hands of generations of believers. My hands. I felt the weight of their faith, their hopes, their unanswered prayers, and in that moment it felt like a stone, a burden I could no longer carry. As I walked down that aisle, I saw their faces. Shock, confusion. Old Mrs. Evelyn at the organ, her hands frozen over the keys. I saw Abigail turn, and the look in her eyes. It wasn't just shame. It was a deep, profound sorrow, as if she were watching me die right there in front of everyone. But I couldn't stop. I was a man possessed by his own grief. I reached the front, raised that holy book, and with all the strength my broken heart could muster, I threw it. The sound of it hitting the floor was the sound of my life breaking in two. The silence that followed was God's turn to speak. The silence in that church was a living thing. It was heavier than the humid summer air, thicker than the dust motes dancing in the stained glass light. Every eye was on me, a sinner standing at the altar I had just defiled. I saw Abigail's face, a mask of disbelief and heartbreak, her hands covering her mouth. I saw Pastor Michael frozen behind the pulpit, his sermon forgotten. In that moment I expected whispers, condemnation, maybe someone to drag me out by the collar. What I felt instead was a profound, hollow emptiness. My grand act of defiance, the final roar of my broken faith, had left me feeling small, pathetic. A fool shouting at a God who wasn't even there to listen. That was my first mistake, thinking he wasn't listening. And then the world split open. It wasn't thunder. I've lived my whole life under these skies. I know the sound of a summer storm. This was something else. It was a crack, a sound that didn't just travel through the air, but seemed to tear the very fabric of it. It was a sound that vibrated in my bones, in my teeth. Simultaneously, a light flooded the church, a light so absolute and pure it wasn't white, it was the absence of all color. It poured through the arched windows, erasing the reds and blues of the stained glass, turning everything into a stark, terrifying silhouette. It didn't illuminate, it consumed. My gaze was ripped towards the main window, the one that looked out over the churchyard, towards the ancient cypress tree that had stood there longer than the town itself. And I saw it. A column of pure, solid light, a spear of impossible brilliance, lancing down from that clear blue sky and striking the heart of that old tree. There was no explosion in the way you'd think. There was a sound of 1,000 giant bones snapping at once, and the cypress tree, that stalwart giant, simply came apart. It burst into a geyser of white splinters and cold white fire. The screams came then. The holy silence was shattered by a wave of pure animal panic. People were scrambling, pushing, clawing their way over pews to get to the doors. The sound of their terror was a dull roar in my ears, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to that spot, my eyes locked on the impossible bonfire raging outside. It burned with a clean, smokeless flame, each lick of fire a perfect searing white. The heatless light of it pulsed into the church, and I remember thinking with a strange and terrifying clarity that not a single spark, not a single burning ember drifted towards the church. The destruction was surgical. It was precise. It was a message. I felt a shove as Deacon Miller scrambled past me, his face pale with a fear I had never seen on another man. But it wasn't the crowd that brought me down. My legs gave out. One moment I was standing, a pillar of my own foolish pride, and the next my knees hit the worn floorboards with a crack that echoed the breaking of the tree. The strength, the rage, the 40 years of bitterness that had carried me down that aisle, it all drained out of me, leaving nothing but a fragile, trembling shell. The bones inside my legs felt as if they'd turned to dust. The church emptied in a matter of seconds, the screams fading as people fled into the street. And then there was a new silence, a silence of awe and terror. I was still there on my knees. Pastor Michael was still behind the pulpit, his hand clutching his chest, his face a mixture of horror and something I could only describe as dreadful reverence. And to my right, old Miss Evelyn was still at her organ, but her hands weren't on the keys. They were folded in her lap, and her gaze was fixed on the window, not with fear, but as if she were listening to the second half of a conversation I had just started. I had spent years shouting into what I thought was an empty sky, cursing a silent and indifferent God for my pain. And in a single terrible instant, the sky had shouted back. The silence I had railed against was gone, replaced by an answer so loud, so final, that it had shaken the foundations of the world and my own soul. The fear that washed over me then was nothing like the fear of a bad harvest or a mounting debt. This was a deep, primal, holy terror. The fear of a creature who has just realized he is standing in the presence of his Maker, not as a beloved son, but as an insect who has just insulted the sun. That fire outside wasn't a punishment, not yet. It felt like a signature, an exclamation point at the end of a sentence I could not comprehend. My war was over. I had thrown my last punch, and the heavens had answered not with a fist, but with a flick of a finger that had shattered my entire world. If this story is touching something deep inside you, if you've ever felt that moment when everything you thought you knew is burned away, please hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. You won't want to miss the penance that came after the fire. I stayed on my knees for what felt like an eternity. The world outside the church walls was a chaos of distant sirens and panicked shouts, but inside there was a new kind of silence. The fire that consumed the old cypress tree wasn't a normal fire. It burned with a cold, silent intensity, casting long, dancing shadows into the sanctuary that twisted and writhed like guilty spirits. Every other soul had fled, except for the pastor, who was now slumped into a pew, his head in his hands, and Miss Evelyn, who hadn't moved from her organ bench. She was just watching the fire, her ancient, wrinkled face as calm as if she were watching a sunrise. But I couldn't look at them. I couldn't look at anything but the floorboards, at the dust and the grime, because I was certain that if I looked up, I would see the face of God, and the judgment in his eyes would unmake me completely. The rage was gone. The pride that had puffed up my chest and carried me down that aisle had been incinerated in that single flash of light. All that was left was a hollow, cavernous shame. I thought of my father, a man who would sooner cut off his own hand than show disrespect in the house of the Lord. I thought of my mother, whose gentle hands had first opened that Bible for me, her voice a soft melody as she read of shepherds and kings. I had taken their legacy, their faith, and I had thrown it on the ground like a piece of trash. The weight of it was a physical thing, pressing down on my shoulders, forcing my head lower and lower until my forehead touched the dusty floor. I didn't pray for forgiveness. I didn't know how. I didn't deserve it. I was waiting for the second strike, the one that wouldn't miss, the one that would turn me into the same smoldering ash as that tree. I closed my eyes and whispered the only prayer I had left. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It wasn't a plea. It was a confession before a sentence I was ready to accept. And then something shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a change in the quality of the light against my eyelids. The harsh, flickering glare from the fire outside softened, mellowed. The heatless intensity was replaced by a warmth, a gentle, pervasive warmth that felt like a hand being laid on my back. It wasn't a physical hand, but it was just as real. It seeped through my shirt, through my skin, and into the very marrow of my bones, chasing out the cold despair that had lived there for so long. I didn't dare open my eyes, but I was no longer alone in that church. A presence had filled the space, a presence so vast and ancient it made the fire outside seem like a candle flame. But there was no anger in it. There was no thunderous judgment. There was only a profound and bottomless sorrow. It was a grief so pure it felt feminine, like the weeping of a mother for a son who has lost his way. It washed over me in waves, and in that sorrow there was an ocean of mercy. It wasn't a voice that spoke words, but a feeling that communicated a truth more clearly than any sermon. I see your pain, I see your pride, I see your sin, and I love you still. The sheer, undeserved grace of it shattered what was left of me. The sobs that came out of me weren't the angry, frustrated tears I had shed for years over my dying wife and my dead fields. These were tears of a different kind. They were the tears of a condemned man who has just been pardoned for no reason he can understand. They were tears of shame, yes, but a shame cleansed by a love so powerful It felt like it was remaking my heart, beat by painful beat. I wept for my bitterness. I wept for my blasphemy. I wept for the years I had wasted, shouting at a God who was only waiting for me to be quiet enough to hear his answer. Slowly, the supernatural fire outside began to die down, its white flames receding into glowing, pulsing embers. The unearthly presence in the church didn't leave, but it settled, becoming a quiet hum in the background of my soul. I heard a soft footstep on the worn carpet behind me. I tensed, expecting the deacon to finally haul me to my feet and cast me out. But the step was too light. A hand, a real one this time, rested on my shoulder. It was small and gentle. I looked up, my eyes blurry with tears, and saw my daughter, Abigail. Her face was pale, stained with her own tears, but her eyes held none of the shame or anger I had seen before. They held only a reflection of the same impossible sorrow and love I had just felt. She didn't say a word. She just knelt beside me on that dirty floor, amidst the splinters of my shattered pride, and held me while I cried. Her forgiveness was the first earthly echo of that heavenly mercy. As she helped me to my feet, my legs shaking like a newborn colt's, my eyes caught a glint on the floor near the pulpit. It was a piece of the stained glass window of the Virgin Mary, the one my mother had always loved, shattered by the force of the thunderclap. A shard of deep cobalt blue glass lay on the floorboards. The last of the light from the embers outside caught it, and through my tear-filled eyes, it looked for all the world like a single, perfect teardrop. It was a confirmation, a small, tangible piece of a miracle I would never be able to explain. The mercy I received in that moment was a fire far more powerful than the one that consumed the tree. If you want to see how that fire began to reshape a man who was nothing but ash, make sure you hit that like button and turn on all notifications, because the hardest work was yet to come. The days that followed were a blur of hushed whispers and sideways glances from the townsfolk. I was no longer just Silas, the farmer whose luck had run dry. I was the man who had thrown the Bible, the man the sky had answered. In their eyes, I saw a confusing mix of fear, pity, and a strange, unwelcome reverence. They didn't know what to make of me, and frankly, neither did I. My mind, the same practical, stubborn mind that knew how to fix a tractor engine and predict the weather by the ache in my joints, went to war with my soul. It fought desperately to reclaim the solid ground of reason from the flood of the impossible. It was a freak of nature, my mind insisted. Ball lightning. A rare but documented atmospheric phenomenon. The cypress was old, probably hollowed out by disease, a perfect tinderbox waiting for a spark. The timing? A 1 in a billion coincidence. My experience inside the church, the presence, the feeling of maternal sorrow, that overwhelming wave of mercy, was nothing more than the product of a grief-addled mind, a psychological break brought on by years of stress and sorrow. I repeated these explanations to myself in the dead of night, lying next to Martha's fragile sleeping form. I whispered them like a creed, trying to rebuild the logical walls that had been so utterly demolished. But the words felt hollow, like stones dropped into a bottomless well. They made no sound, they changed nothing, because a coincidence doesn't leave a witness in your pocket. I had picked up that shard of blue glass from the floor of the church, the piece from the Virgin Mary's robe. I kept it in the coin pocket of my work jeans. Throughout the day, my calloused fingers would find their way to it. It was cool and smooth, and sometimes when the light hit it just right, it seemed to pulse with a soft internal light of its own. It felt alive. And then there were the dreams. They weren't nightmares of fire and destruction. They were quiet dreams. I'd be standing in my barren field under a sky filled with stars, and a gentle rain would begin to fall. But it wasn't water. It was light, tiny drops of liquid light that didn't get me wet, but seemed to soak right into my soul, washing away the grit and the bitterness. I would wake up with the phantom feeling of that cleansing rain on my face and the scent of burnt cypress still lingering in the room. If you've ever felt that struggle between what your mind tells you is real and what your heart knows to be true, do me a favor and press that like button and make sure that bell is rung so you don't miss what happened when I finally stopped fighting. The shame was the worst part. It was a constant low-grade fever in my spirit. Every rationalization I attempted was shouted down by the memory of my own arrogance. I remembered with a clarity that made my stomach clench the countless times I had mocked the very things that were now my only comfort. I remembered an evening, years ago, before Martha got really sick. She was sitting in her rocking chair by the window, her rosary beads clicking softly through her fingers as she prayed. I'd come in from the fields, tired and angry at the cloudless sky, and I'd sneered at her. "Still talking to your beads, Martha," I'd said, my voice dripping with contempt. "You think rattling those little pieces of glass is going to make it rain?" The hurt in her eyes was a physical blow, but my pride wouldn't let me take it back. I had called her faith a superstition, a crutch for the weak. Now the memory of my cruelty was 1,000 times heavier than the Bible I had thrown. I had despised the symbols of a mercy I was utterly dependent on. One night I couldn't stand it anymore. Martha was asleep, her breathing a shallow rhythmic whisper in the darkness. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that usually marked the steady march towards another day of loss. But tonight it sounded like a countdown. I was being called to do something, to answer for the man I had been. I walked into our bedroom and quietly opened the top drawer of her dresser. The scent of lavender and old cedar drifted out. There, nestled amongst her neatly folded handkerchiefs, was her rosary, the one I had mocked. The wooden beads were worn smooth from decades of her touch, the small silver crucifix tarnished with age. My hand trembled as I reached for it. My big clumsy fingers, stained with the dirt of a faithless land, felt profane touching something so sacred. I lifted it from the drawer. It was lighter than I expected, but it felt like it carried the weight of every prayer she had ever whispered for me, for our family, for our farm. I stood there in the moonlight, filtering through the window, just holding it. My mind screamed at me. "What are you doing? This is foolishness. You're a hypocrite." And for the first time, another voice, a quieter one, answered back. "Yes, you are. So be humble and listen for once." I walked back into the living room and sank into my old armchair. I didn't know the prayers. I didn't know the mysteries. All I knew was the shape of the cross in my palm. I looked at the tiny, suffering figure of Christ, and for the first time, I didn't see weakness. I saw a love so profound it was willing to absorb the entire world's hatred, my hatred, and offer forgiveness in return. I thought of the light in the church, the feeling of a mother's sorrow. I saw the connection, the silent suffering, the unconditional love. The tears started again, but they were quiet this time. They weren't the ragged sobs of a broken man, but the silent, cleansing tears of a penitent one. I didn't speak a word. I just sat there in the dark, clutching that rosary to my chest, letting the truth of what I had seen and the shame of who I had been wash over me. It was a silent surrender, an admission that my way, the way of pride, anger, and bitterness, had led me to a dead end. And in that silence, in that darkness, holding a symbol I had once despised, a new path began to reveal itself. Word travels fast in a small town, but a story like mine doesn't travel. It ignites. It became a fire of its own, spreading from farmhouse to farmhouse, whispered over the counter at the general store, debated in hushed tones after the emergency town meeting about the freak weather event. The official story was ball lightning, a geological anomaly, a once-in-a-lifetime coincidence, but nobody really believed it was that simple. They had seen my face. They had heard the Bible hit the floor. They had felt that unholy crack in the sky. And so the stories about me began to take on a life of their own. To some, I was a madman, a grieving husband who had finally snapped under the pressure. I'd hear them stop talking when I walked into the feed store, their eyes following me with a mixture of pity and fear. Old Jedediah, who I'd known my whole life, told my son-in-law that I'd probably rigged the tree with something, a desperate cry for attention. I didn't blame him. The man I had been was capable of that kind of foolish, destructive pride. Others took a darker view. They said I had called something down, that my blasphemy had opened a door and something malevolent had answered. They saw the fire not as a warning, but as a mark of the demonic. Children would cross the street to avoid walking past my property. Their fear was a bitter pill to swallow, but I understood it. I had declared war on heaven. Some of them figured hell had answered the call to arms. A few, the ones who tried to be kind, would pull me aside with worried looks on their faces. They'd talk about hallucinations, about the tricks a mind can play when it's drowning in sorrow. "Silas," they'd say, their voices gentle, "you've been through so much, it's understandable you'd see things." They were trying to offer me an escape, a way back to the comfortable, logical world we had all lived in before that Sunday. They wanted to convince me that nothing supernatural had happened, but I would just shake my head, my hand instinctively going to the small shard of blue glass in my pocket. I wouldn't argue. The old me, the proud and angry Silas, would have launched into a furious defense. But that man was gone, burned away. All I would say, my voice quiet but firm, was, "It was the most real thing that has ever happened to me." And the certainty in my own heart was an anchor that no storm of doubt or ridicule could move. I found my solace not in arguing, but in small, quiet acts of penance. I started attending church again, not the main Sunday service at first. That felt too public, too raw. I would go on a Tuesday afternoon when the sanctuary was empty and just sit in the back pew. I'd look at the new plain glass window where the Virgin Mary used to be, and I'd just be silent. I'd hold Martha's rosary, its beads a comforting weight in my calloused palm, and I would just listen. Pastor Michael would sometimes see me there. He never approached me with questions or sermons. He'd just give me a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement that this space was for healing, and he would leave me to it. That quiet acceptance was more powerful than any sermon on forgiveness. My daughter Abigail was my rock. She saw the change in me, the slow ebbing of the bitterness that had poisoned our family for years. She saw me start to care for Martha with a tenderness I hadn't shown in a long time, not just as a duty, but as a privilege. I'd read to her, not from the newspaper, but from the Psalms, my voice thick with emotion, as I rediscovered the words my mother had once read to me. The very words I had rejected. My true test came a few months later at the annual town harvest festival. It wasn't much of a harvest that year, but the tradition was more about community than corn. It was held in the town square, a stone's throw from the church, where the stump of the old cypress tree stood as a stark, silent monument to that day. I knew people would be watching me, whispering. I knew I had to speak, not to defend myself, but to testify. When the time for announcements came, I walked up to the small wooden stage. A hush fell over the crowd. I could feel their collective breath being held. I looked out at their faces, skeptical, curious, fearful. I saw my daughter Abigail holding my wife's hand in the front row, her eyes shining with tears of hope. I cleared my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Most of you," I began, my voice unsteady at first, "most of you saw me at my absolute worst right over there in that church. You saw a man so full of pride and rage that he threw the word of God on the floor." I paused, letting the weight of that admission settle. I was that man. I was a man who cursed the sky for being silent, and a man who mocked my own wife for her faith. I remember telling her that her rosary was just a string of beads, a useless superstition. I looked directly at Martha, who gave me a weak but radiant smile. I was wrong, I was a fool, because on the day my pride finally broke me in two, when I was on my knees expecting to be struck down for my sins, I wasn't met with anger. I was met with a mercy so profound it felt like the sorrow of a mother for her lost child. The very things I had rejected, the symbols of a patient, forgiving love, were the only things that had the power to lift me from the floor. I took a deep breath. I can't explain what happened that day with lightning or science. I can only tell you what I know. I know that I was shown a grace I did not earn, and I do not deserve. I'm here to ask for your forgiveness, for the scandal I caused, for the fear I created, for the disrespect I showed to this community and to the house of God. I looked at Abigail. And for the pain I caused my own family. I am sorry. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't shock or fear. It was thick with emotion. I saw old Jedediah wipe a tear from his eye. I saw neighbors who had shunned me look at me with a new understanding. My journey isn't about changing a religion. It's about having my entire heart replaced. It's about the miracle that happens when pride is burned away and replaced with humility, when rebellion is finally silenced by a love that refuses to let go. My story isn't about lightning striking a tree. It's about mercy striking a man's hardened heart. If this story of a second chance, of a mercy that finds us even when we've turned our back, has touched your heart, I ask you to please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, making sure to ring that notification bell. My journey is far from over, and I'd be honored to share more of it with you. And in the comments below, if you feel so moved, I'd be humbled if you would share a single word that describes what mercy means to you. Your faith, in all its forms, is a light in this world. Thank you for letting me share mine.